You are carrying a computer right now. You almost certainly know this. You probably don't think about it. It sits in your pocket or your bag, smaller than a paperback book, lighter than a glass of water, and it performs more calculations per second than all the computers that existed on Earth combined in 1960. This is not hyperbole. It is a measurable fact. And yet, almost no one could tell you where it came from. Not really. Not the full story. Most people, if you ask them who invented the computer, will say one of two names. IBM. Or maybe Alan Turing. Both answers are wrong, or rather, both answers are incomplete in ways that matter. Because the history of the computer is not a straight line from one inventor to one invention. It is a tangle, a collision of independent ideas, institutional suppression, wartime secrecy, legal battles, and at least two instances where the person who did the most foundational work received almost none of the credit. By the end of this, you will know who actually built the first electronic computer. You will understand why most people have never heard of him, and you will see, one more time, the pattern that runs through almost every great invention in history. The person who does it first is rarely the person history remembers. To understand the computer, you have to start not with electronics, but with mathematics. Specifically, with a problem that had frustrated mathematicians for centuries: calculation. Mathematical calculation, the process of working through a complex equation step by step, is something the human brain does slowly, unreliably, and with great effort. A single trained mathematician, working carefully, might perform 100 arithmetic operations in an hour. For most of human history, that was the ceiling. The speed of calculation was the speed of a human being with a pen. And this was not just an academic problem, it was a practical one. By the 19th century, the world ran on calculated tables. Tables of logarithms for navigation, tables of ballistic trajectories for artillery, tables of insurance premiums, of astronomical positions, of engineering tolerances. These tables were produced by teams of human calculators, people whose entire job was to perform arithmetic, hour after hour, day after day. They were called computers, not machines, people. The word computer originally meant a human being who computed. The errors these human computers made were constant, consequential, and almost impossible to eliminate. A mistake in a logarithm table could send a ship onto the rocks. A mistake in a ballistic table could mean a shell fell short of its target. The desire for a machine that could compute without human error was not the fantasy of a science fiction writer. It was a practical engineering goal with life and death stakes. The first serious attempt to build such a machine came from a British mathematician named Charles Babbage. In 1822, Babbage proposed what he called a difference engine, a mechanical device that could automatically calculate and print mathematical tables using the method of finite differences. He began building it. The British government funded it. It was, for its era, an extraordinary conception. It was never completed. The engineering tolerances required were beyond what Victorian manufacturing could reliably achieve. The funding ran out. The relationship with his engineer collapsed. Babbage moved on to an even more ambitious design, the analytical engine, which would have been, in principle, a fully programmable mechanical computer. But that was never built either. Babbage died in 1871, having spent 40 years and a fortune on machines that remained unfinished. But the ideas, and especially the work of Ada Lovelace, who wrote what is now recognized as the first computer program for the analytical engine in 1843, those ideas did not disappear. They waited. The next leap came not from mathematics, but from logic. In the 1930s, a young American mathematician named Claude Shannon was working on his master's thesis at MIT. His subject sounds dry: the analysis of relay circuits in telephone switching systems. What he discovered was anything but. Shannon showed that the binary language of Boolean algebra, a system of logic developed by the British mathematician George Boole in the 1850s, in which every statement is either true or false, every operation is either and, or not, could be perfectly implemented using electrical circuits. A circuit that was open corresponded to false or zero. A circuit that was closed corresponded to true or one. This was the conceptual key to everything that followed. If you could represent logical operations using electrical switches, then you could build a machine that performed logical operations automatically at the speed of electricity without any human intervention. A machine that thought in ones and zeros. A machine that could, in principle, solve any problem that could be expressed in logical terms. Shannon's thesis, published in 1937, has been called the most important master's thesis of the 20th century. It is not an exaggeration. Almost every digital device ever built rests on the insight it contained. But Shannon described the principle. Someone still had to build the machine. In the summer of 1937, a physics professor at Iowa State College was driving alone through the night on a long road trip, thinking about a problem. His name was John Vincent Atanasoff. He was 34 years old, the son of a Bulgarian immigrant, and he had spent the better part of 2 years trying to solve a specific computational problem: how to find solutions to systems of linear equations with many variables. The calculations required were enormous. They were beyond the capacity of any mechanical calculator available at the time.
He had been working on the problem for months.
He was stuck. He was frustrated. And somewhere on a cold Illinois highway, he stopped at a roadhouse, ordered bourbon, and sat alone for several hours. What happened in that roadhouse, by his own account, was that the solution came. Not all at once, not as a single flash of inspiration, but as a series of interconnected ideas that settled into place with the quiet certainty of something that had been building for a long time. He would use electronics, not mechanical parts. Vacuum tubes, the same technology used in radios and amplifiers, could act as switches, opening and closing circuits far faster than any mechanical relay. He would use binary arithmetic, base 2, not base 10, ones and zeros, simpler to implement in electronics, more reliable. He would use a regenerative memory system, capacitors that stored charge and were periodically refreshed, maintaining the state of a calculation. And he would separate the memory from the processing, so that data could be moved between the two while computation was happening. These were not minor technical choices. They were the foundational architectural decisions that define every computer ever built since.
Atanasoff returned to Iowa State
and began building. He recruited a graduate student named Clifford Berry, and the two of them worked in the basement of the physics building for 3 years on what would become known as the Atanasoff-Berry computer, the ABC. It was not a general-purpose computer. It was designed specifically to solve systems of linear equations. It had no stored program. You had to set it up manually for each calculation. But it was electronic. It was binary. It used regenerative memory. It had a clock speed. It worked. In the late spring of 1942, the Atanasoff-Berry computer successfully solved a set of equations that would have taken a human calculator weeks. It was the first electronic digital computer in history, and almost no one knew about it. In June of 1941, a year before the ABC was complete, Atanasoff received a visitor. His name was John Mauchly. He was a physicist from Pennsylvania, also interested in the problem of large-scale calculation. He had heard, through the network of American academics, that Atanasoff was working on something interesting. He wrote to ask if he could visit.
Atanasoff said yes.
Mauchly spent 5 days at Iowa State in June 1941. He saw the ABC. He discussed its design with Atanasoff in detail. He read Atanasoff's 35-page manuscript describing the machine's principles. He took notes. He returned to Pennsylvania, and in 1943, Mauchly and his colleague J. Presper Eckert began work on a new electronic computer at the University of Pennsylvania, funded by the United States Army. They called it the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, ENIAC. ENIAC was, by almost any measure, a more impressive machine than the ABC. It was designed to calculate artillery firing tables, a critical wartime priority. It used 18,000 vacuum tubes. It weighed 30 tons. It filled an entire room. When it was unveiled in 1946, it was the most powerful calculating machine ever publicly demonstrated, and the press called it the first electronic computer in history. Mauchly and Eckert filed patents for ENIAC and its successors. The patents were enormously valuable. The Sperry Rand Corporation eventually acquired them and used them to collect licensing fees from every computer manufacturer in the United States.
IBM
Paid. Honeywell paid. Everyone paid. Everyone, that is, except Honeywell, who eventually decided not to keep paying and instead filed a lawsuit. The case was Honeywell versus Sperry Rand, and it began in 1967. It ran for 6 years. It produced records that fill a room. And in 1973, Judge Earl Larson issued a ruling that was one of the most significant legal decisions in the history of technology. He ruled that the ENIAC patents were invalid. The reason? The key inventions claimed in the ENIAC patents had been derived from Atanasoff's prior work. The judge's finding was explicit. Mauchly had visited Atanasoff. Mauchly had studied the ABC. The concepts in ENIAC were not independent inventions. They were derived. The first electronic digital computer, the court ruled, was the Atanasoff-Berry computer. Atanasoff was alive to hear the ruling. He was 69 years old. He had spent 30 years watching other men receive credit for ideas he had developed in a basement in Iowa. While Atanasoff was building in a basement in Iowa, something was happening on the other side of the Atlantic that would remain secret for 30 years.
In the British countryside,
At a Victorian estate called Bletchley Park, the British government had assembled the most remarkable collection of mathematical talent ever gathered in one place. Crossword puzzle champions, chess masters, linguists, classicists, mathematicians of every kind. Their mission was to break the German Enigma cipher, the encryption system that protected every piece of German military communication. Among them was a 30-year-old mathematician from Cambridge named Alan Turing. Turing had already done something extraordinary years before the war. In 1936, he had published a paper on computable numbers with an application to the Entscheidungsproblem that solved a problem in mathematical logic by inventing, in the process, a theoretical machine. The Turing machine, as it came to be known, was not a physical device. It was a thought experiment, a description of an idealized computing machine that could read and write symbols on an infinite tape according to a table of rules. Turing used this imaginary machine to prove that certain mathematical problems were, in principle, unsolvable. The paper was foundational work in what would become computer science.
But more than that,
The paper defined what a computer is. Not any particular machine, but the abstract concept of a universal computing device that could, given the right instructions, simulate any other computing process. This was the theoretical architecture. Atanasoff built the physical one. They were working on the same thing from opposite ends. At Bletchley Park, Turing and his colleagues built something called the bomb, an electromechanical device that could systematically test possible Enigma settings until it found one that produced intelligible German text. By 1941, with improvements, it was breaking Enigma messages faster than the Germans could change their settings. And then, in 1943, an engineer named Tommy Flowers built something even more significant: Colossus. Colossus was fully electronic. It used 2,500 vacuum tubes. It could process 5,000 characters per second. It was designed to break the Lorenz cipher, a more sophisticated German encryption system used for the highest-level communications. It worked. Colossus was, by any reasonable definition, a programmable electronic computer. It predated ENIAC by 3 years. But Colossus was classified, top secret. The British government did not reveal its existence until 1975. The engineers who built it could not talk about it. For 30 years, history proceeded without it. The story of Alan Turing is one of the most painful in the history of science. Not because his work was forgotten, it was not, or at least not entirely, but because of what his country did to him. After the war, Turing worked at the National Physical Laboratory and later at the University of Manchester, helping to build some of the first stored program computers, machines that could hold their instructions in memory rather than having them set up manually, which was the decisive step toward the modern computer. He published in 1950 a paper called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, the paper that introduced the question, "Can machines think?" and proposed what he called the imitation game, now known as the Turing test. It is one of the most cited papers in the history of artificial intelligence, and it was written by a man who had already helped win a world war with a machine no one was allowed to know existed. In 1952, Turing was arrested. The charge was gross indecency. He was gay in a country where homosexuality was a criminal offense. He was convicted. The alternative to imprisonment was chemical castration, a course of hormone injections that the court offered as a form of treatment. He accepted it.
he lost his security clearance.
He was barred from continuing his classified work. A man who had, by credible historical accounts, helped shorten the Second World War by 2 years, thereby saving an estimated 14 million lives, was chemically castrated by the government he had served. On the 7th of June 1954, Alan Turing was found dead in his home. A half-eaten apple was beside him. The coroner ruled suicide by cyanide poisoning, though some people who knew him disputed this finding. He was 41 years old. In 2009, the British Prime Minister issued a formal apology on behalf of the government. In 2013, Turing received a royal pardon. He had been dead for 59 years. Let me try to say clearly what was actually happening in these years. The late 1930s and 1940s, across multiple countries, in secret laboratories and university basements and wartime facilities. Multiple people, working independently or in loose contact, were solving the same problem from different angles, under different pressures, with different tools and different goals. Atanasoff was solving equations. Turing was breaking codes. Mauchly and Eckert were calculating artillery trajectories. Flowers was reading German high command.
They were all building computers.
What ENIAC's fame obscured, what the classification of Colossus obscured, what Atanášov's institutional isolation obscured, was that the computer was not invented. It was converged upon by many people from many directions in response to the same underlying truth, that the world had become too complex to calculate by hand, and that electricity could do what human beings could not. The patent system, which is designed to assign invention to an individual, could not cleanly handle a development this distributed. And so the courts eventually ruled, and the historians eventually concluded, that the story was more complicated than the headlines had suggested. Atanášov did not build the first computer that mattered to the public, but he built the first one. Turing did not build the first machine that computed, but he defined what computing means. And the machine you are carrying right now, the device that descended from all of their work through decades of refinement and miniaturization and engineering that none of them could have fully imagined. That machine does not belong to any one of them. It belongs to all of them. In 1950, Alan Turing published the paper that asked whether machines could think.
He framed it as a game.
A person sits at a terminal and exchanges text messages with two entities in another room, one human, one machine. If the person cannot reliably determine which is which, the machine has passed the test. Turing himself believed that by the year 2000, computers would be capable of this. He was roughly correct. The question of whether any machine has truly passed the Turing test is still debated. But there is something more interesting in the paper than the test itself. In it, Turing anticipates almost every objection that would be raised against the idea of machine intelligence over the following 70 years. He addresses them, one by one, with patience and clarity, and a slight hint of impatience for people who refuse to follow the logic. He was writing in 1950, with a 2,500 tube machine in the building next door, and a conviction that had destroyed his career and was destroying his body. He was writing about a future he would not live to see. And in that paper, almost as a footnote, he wrote something that I find worth holding on to. He wrote that the question of whether machines can think is itself too meaningless to deserve discussion. That the real question, the one worth asking, is simply what machines can do.
And then he spent the rest of his short life
showing that the answer was almost everything. The computer you carry was not invented by any single person. It was built by dozens, over decades, in secret and in public, in war and in peace. Some of them were celebrated. Some of them were erased from the record by classification or litigation or simple neglect. One of them was destroyed by the country he had saved. But the machine runs. The calculation completes. The question gets answered. And in that answer, instant, silent, effortless, is the accumulated work of everyone who ever sat alone in a basement or a roadhouse or a wartime hut and refused to stop thinking.